biohacking, performance, mastery, mindset, holistic health. This is a show about getting better every single day. I'm on a mission, guys, to help over 1 million people get healthy and lose weight. Why? Because when you lose weight and get healthy, you have higher self-esteem. You have more self-confidence. And that person goes out and crushes their goals and starts living the highest version of themselves, and then they have way more impact on the world. What's up, guys? Happy Wednesday. Happy hump day. Let's get into it. Today, I want to talk about statins. I want to talk about cholesterol. I want to talk about the truth behind statins and cholesterol. I think there is a lot of misnomers and a lot of bad information and old science. And I want to just correct all of that. Before I do, I just want to make a quick announcement. I've made this before, but if you guys are just tuning into the show, I really want to help people lose weight and get healthy. And it's actually the opposite. I'm sorry. I didn't even say that right. I want to help people get healthy, and then the byproduct is weight loss. And one of the easiest ways I can do that is just giving you some free stuff and getting you started. I think just getting this momentum, building some of these baby steps is really crucial. So if you're interested, I created a little blueprint, a little cheat sheet. I call it the weight loss diet template or blueprint. And I want to give that to you for free. It's something I give all my private weight loss clients and wellness clients, and I want to give it to you. So if you're interested, simply reach out to me, shoot me an email, info@joelevancoaching.com, and just say, Joel, I want it. Give me the blueprint. Give me the weight loss cheat sheet. Or, comment below, or you can even just shoot me a DM. I'm pretty active on Instagram. Shoot me a DM and say that you want that, and I'm going to send it over to you. No questions asked. Cool. All right, let's get into this thing. We're talking about LDL, HDL. What is going on? What's the truth about this? Because last week I talked a lot about, some of the things that you can do for fat burning. And this always comes up, saturated fat being a controversial fuel. And I really don't think it should be. There's a lot of bad science. We talked about Ansel Keys last week. Let's get into it a little bit more. So here's what we really know. Insulin resistance. This is what is causing a lot of the inflammation and a lot of the issues with plaque in the arteries. It's causing an excess of triglycerides that are floating around in the circulatory system. And what happens is it deposits along the walls of the arteries. This is what's leading that arteriosclerosis, right? That's where these heart attacks and strokes are coming from. So when triglyceride and sugar, when it can't gain access to your body fat, what happens is they just stay in the bloodstream. And this starts to promote the development of plaque in your arteries. What we've been taught about these LDL, these lipoproteins, is that they're bad cholesterol. Now, HDL, we know, is the high density, right, lipoproteins. And we've been told that these are the good proteins. Now, here's what I want to just throw out there. There is no good or bad. Like, get that out of your head. These lipoproteins, they are carrier mechanisms. They are delivery mechanisms. Think of these lipoproteins like the FedEx for your fat. Their job is to transport fat through your arteries. They're not necessarily the bad cholesterol, okay? Our body makes cholesterol for a reason. And most of us, we think that cholesterol is mostly, we're getting it from food. It's not true. It's made up of our cells. Our cell membranes are made of this fat, this cholesterol. And your body requires this cholesterol for all of its membranes. Without it, you wouldn't be able to make the essential building blocks of important hormones like testosterone, estrogen, cortisol. You would die. So most doctors are telling us, hey, if you eat cholesterol goes up. Absolutely not true. And one of the most powerful factors causing cholesterol to actually rise is, guess what? Burning body fat. That actually makes your LDL go up. So for them to say something ridiculous like that, eating cholesterol makes you, cholesterol high foods is going to make you have more cholesterol. Like, just stop it. Just stop it. This is old science that needs to be looked at again. And we've seen where a lot of this old science goes, and no one's really looked at it again, or they just care to overlook it. And we've been promoting this for a long time. Guess what? Eating whole foods, guys, that are naturally high in fat, especially the saturated monounsaturated fats that I talked about last week, right? Like the saturated fats you get from the butter, the coconut oil, or the monounsaturated you get from the olive oil, right? That makes your HDL go up. That's the HDL. That's what all the doctors are saying. You need to have higher HDL. Well, yeah, if you want that, guess what? You actually have to eat these things that have saturated fat and monounsaturated fat. So Get that out of your head. That's old news. Now, what happens though is the LDL, it gets stuck in your arteries. And so what has happened is the scientists said, oh, well, we're seeing a high level of LDL that is forming this plaque in the arteries. Therefore, cholesterol must be bad. And that's just not true. Also, this is really exciting. I had planned to do this topic a week ago, and I want to share with you guys at the end of this episode. I'm going to actually share, there was a huge journal article just written by a great doctor, Dr. Bikram, and he has an amazing book called Why We Get Sick, which is amazing. And I actually need to get him on the podcast to talk about it. It was one of the most profound books that I read last year. And he just released a huge article talking about why statins are a complete joke, especially if you're just using a good, healthy diet, like a low carbohydrate diet. And so I'm going to get into that article at the end. I just want to give you a brief overview about HDL, LDL, triglycerides, and just kind of talking about some of these concepts that, you might be familiar with, but you're just getting kind of the surface area level things that are talked about at the doctor's office, right? So what we have seen though, right, is higher LDL is actually a good thing, guys. We've been taught that it's not, but it's actually been associated with less likelihood of dementia, cancer, infectious disease, and prolonged lifespan. So really, really huge. Now, what they found in just mice studies is that mice that had increased levels of LDL, they were 8 times more resistant to endotoxins. Endotoxins, what they were doing is endotoxins, obviously think of a toxin coming from the outside coming into your body. Now, these toxins, they were injecting gram-negative bacteria into the rats. And they wanted to see like, hey, what's going to happen to these mice? How will their body fight it off? And they found that they were 8 times more resistant to these endotoxins. Really, really amazing. When the rats with the lower LDL, guess what? They found higher mortality rates. Now, you might be asking yourself, but Joel, what about in human studies? Don't worry. We have those too. There's several meta-analyses actually, like with 60,000 people showing exactly what I'm talking about. But there's some other studies I just want to talk about today. One is, it was a sample size of only 347 individuals. So not that many, but over the age of 65. And they found that those with low total cholesterol had significantly higher risk of dying of these non-vascular diseases, while the ones with the elevated total cholesterol had half the risk compared to the reference population. They did another study, 105 folks in Iceland over the age of 80, found the exact same thing. The Leiden 85 study was a study that confirmed, again, the same thing. 724 people in the Netherlands, they measured all-cause mortality over 10 years. The authors found that for every 38 milligrams per deciliter of an increase in total cholesterol, there was a corresponding 15% decrease in the risk of dying over time. Mortality from cancer, infection, all of this lowered amongst the group that had a higher total cholesterol. So what we have seen, and by the way, there's several more studies because some of the ones I gave you were a little bit lower, and I'm happy to share more of those studies. And don't worry, because at the end, I'm going to talk about this most recent paper published by Dr. Bikram. Really amazing stuff. So the question is, where did we get this idea? Is LDL, is this cholesterol, this type of lipoprotein, is it a criminal or is it a firefighter? And I think what we've misunderstood is that, again, imagine you go to the scene of an accident and you see a big car crash or something, and then you see all these firefighters around there or police officers, and you might start to form the correlation or the causation that, oh, whenever there's an accident, I see a bunch of firefighters around. Firefighters must be causing these accidents. That's kind of what's happened with LDL. And we've just come to this, and it's old science referencing this Framingham study. Framingham is a city in Massachusetts. They followed over 5,000 people over 10 years. And what they saw is that, oh, these people that had higher LDL, they had an increase in heart disease. And so that must be the reason. The issue is this. It's not the LDL. It's when the LDL becomes oxidized. It alters the structure of the LDL. This triggers an immune response. The macrophages in your body respond to the area to put out the inflammation, and instead they form these, what they call like these lipid-laden foam cells. That's what they're called, foam cells. And it begins the atherosclerotic process. This plaque then starts to build up. So again, we've been associating, oh, LDL goes up, then that must be the case. Think about how that doesn't make sense, because there's so many trillions of LDL particles that are all around us. And if that were the case, I mean, we would be dead a long time ago if we were just correlated to LDL. Honestly, it's never been proven that more cholesterol in circulation increases your chance of having heart disease. Never been proven. Matter of fact, vegetarians, they're just as at risk for heart disease or atherosclerosis. They're just as at risk despite having lower levels of LDL. Yes, they do have lower levels of LDL, but they're just as at risk from heart disease. Why is that? Have you guys not asked? Like, why don't you ask yourself that question? Why is that? So here's also another look at HDL. We mentioned LDL a lot. What about HDL? There's a clear correlation between, they've shown a small correlation between total cholesterol and heart disease, right? But in those of the population that had higher HDL levels, the so-called good cholesterol, that correlation almost vanishes completely. So what they're found instead is it's the population that's insulin sensitive, meaning they can actually manage insulin really well, right? They are able to manage their blood glucose, their insulin levels very well. Rising LDL levels, so a high level of LDL cholesterol, doesn't correlate at all with an increase of heart disease, as long as they're insulin sensitive. Now, the group that is insensitive to insulin, meaning they can't regulate their blood glucose levels, they can't regulate the insulin, then that's when they see issues. So one of the things that I ask for a lot of my clients is we start to look at the HDL versus triglyceride ratio. That's a really good positive ratio, and you want it to be, I believe, under 2. That's what you want to be looking for. You don't want to just be looking at total cholesterol and LDL. Like, that means nothing, okay? Means absolutely nothing. And so what it appears that another example that I like is that imagine if you took a tennis ball and you just threw it at a wall that didn't have Velcro. Well, it wouldn't stick, right? And it's the same thing with LDL, right? There's the endothelial cells, and then there's this, they call it the intima. And as the LDL goes through the intima, no matter how many LDL particles are floating around we have in our body, it's really whether these balls, like tennis balls, whether they get stuck to the walls of the intima. If they get stuck there, then you're going to get this molecular Velcro that's being formed. That's what's making them really sticky. LDL on its own is just going to pass through. It's a transporting molecule, right? Think of it again as the FedEx for our fat. It's moving fat around and transporting it. It's moving around from the liver and the blood and traveling through the heart, the liver. It's this circular process. So that's all it is. Insulin resistance, inflammation, that's your problem. That's what you want to be worried about. So studies looking at the arteries of diabetics and the arterial walls, the injury locations, they've seen changes in the proteoglycan matrix that increases in affinity for LDL. That's what's making it stickiness. That's what's causing the injury. So again, I was going to get into chylomicrons and apolipoproteins, but I think it's just a little bit too much for this episode. I want to just kind of cover some basic things. The other thing is, you might be saying, but Joel, so what? You're talking about insulin resistance. You're talking about diabetes and pre-diabetes. I don't have that. And they're saying that I have, plaque in the arteries. And well, yeah, you're right. 35% of Americans right now are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. So why is there such a high level of heart disease? The problem is this: insulin resistance on its own is much more common than you think. There's a stat right now that shows 88% of Americans are metabolically inflexible. They have metabolic dysfunction. That means only 12% of the population is actually in the healthy range and are able to manage their inflammation, really, is what it comes down to. Now let's talk about statins. Okay. So in our bodies, the process to make cholesterol, this is what statins does. It blocks that process. The problem with statins is it also lowers CoQ10. CoQ10 is a powerful antioxidant that people like to take. They go to Costco and they buy all their CoQ10 because they say it's heart healthy, and it is. And there's a lot of mitochondria in our heart, in our brains, in our eyes, in our muscles. But statins lowers that. So it lowers your mitochondria. It's been shown to cause cognitive impairment because your brain needs the synthesis of cholesterol to actually function. And it's being hindered by these statin drugs. And these statins, the use of statins, it decreases, from what the studies show, it decreases the incidence of heart attacks really by a small percentage. And it's not happening through this process of lowering LDL. That's the big issue. They're saying, hey, if we lower LDL, we're going to decrease your chance of heart attacks. And they're not doing that. They're not doing that in the margin that they're saying that it would make it at all significant. Now I want to talk really quickly about this new paper entitled Statin Therapy Not Warranted for a Person with High LDL Cholesterol on a Low Carbohydrate Diet. Now, here's what Dr. Bikram was talking about, and this is what I just mentioned. I want to just go over the bullet points, and then I'm going to go into the nitty gritty. Right now, it says critics of the low carbohydrate diet. Here's bullet point number 1. They focus on its effects of LDL-C, which is largely disregarding the beneficial effects of lower carbohydrate diets on the more robust cardiovascular disease risk factors. So again, he's talking about like all of these other things are dropping. All these other inflammation markers are going down. But the only thing you guys are focusing on with the low carbohydrate diet is, oh, but LDL went up. So big deal. Like this didn't do anything. But again, we just talked about how LDL is not the problem. It's insulin resistance. It's inflammation, right? It's processed food. Bullet point number 2, there's an extensive literature measures which are superior to LDL-C as reliable markers of cardiovascular disease risk, such as hypertension, insulin resistance. I just mentioned there's several LDL particle subtypes. If you go to Wellness FX, that's a great company, a functional kind of like medicine company where you can see like each different subparticle of your LDLs. And we just talk about HDL and LDL. There's so many other ones. So, you want to kind of check out, you want to see like, oh, what is the VLDL? What's like I mentioned, lipoprotein A, right? So there's a lot of things that really contribute to this metabolic syndrome. Let's talk about randomized controlled studies and trials, right? They've demonstrated that individuals with high LDL and low carbohydrate diets that didn't have any issues, they didn't have any plaque in their arteries. They call it non-atherogenic lipid markers. So they had low triglycerides and they had high HDL. They have a lower rate of coronary heart events under non-treatment conditions. Most notably, the subjects with the high LDL and non-atherogenic non-atherogenic, lipid markers, meaning they didn't have plaque in their arteries, right? They derived absolutely no benefit from statin treatment. So, hey, you had high LDL, but you had no plaque in your arteries. And what they found in the studies is the only way to really like measuring LDL particles doesn't mean anything. What they said is if you really want to know if your heart and has plaque in it, you need to do the coronary that it's a CAC. It's called the I'm blanking out, but it's the coronary. It's where they really do a good job of looking a good inspection, and it'll come to me. I have the article up here, but they look at your heart in a very detailed manner. Only that's the only thing that's shown the best data we have to show whether you're going to have like a heart attack or a stroke in the future or have any plaque in the arteries. So that's what you want to look at. LDL means nothing is what they've shown. The last thing I want to talk about, a balanced review of literature indicates statin therapy is not warranted. Again, for if you're on a low carbohydrate diet with elevated LDL, statins aren't going to do anything for you. The only time they really saw statins being beneficial is if your triglycerides were high as well as your HDL was low. So that was a time where it could be implemented, at least in the short run, to kind of help bring those levels down. But at the end of the day, you need to get the diet, you need to get the lifestyle, all these other things, the hypertension, the blood sugar dysregulation. That's way more important. Again, a lot of this stuff in 1985, Brown and Goldstein won a Nobel Prize talking about, again, this correlation between LDL-C and what they were looking at is they were looking at people that had familial hypocholesterolemia. And that basically means people that were born with a genetic defect that they had high amounts of cholesterol. And so what they found is that, hey, these people that have this hypercholesterol in their body, they make too much, they exhibited premature symptoms of cardiovascular disease. So Brown and Goldstein, they said, well, there you go. That is the problem. That's why people with elevated circulating LDL, they get atherosclerosis. Bingo bongo. We're done with this. Close the book, Johnson. Let's start making statins. The problem, and that's where, again, the bad cholesterol has been promoted. We've been getting this this information just fed to us ever since then. And again, what the evidence is showing is that if LDL-C, your cholesterol, is inherently atherogenic, meaning you have, again, a buildup of plaque, and wouldn't this then increase over time? Wouldn't you just continue to get an exposure of higher and higher amounts of LDL-C, and then wouldn't you eventually die? But that's not happening as people age. It has nothing to do with their exposure to LDL-C. So, I mean, that's a huge factor when we're talking about whether high cholesterol is an issue or not, right? To the contrary, they say cardiovascular disease mortality in the FH group, the familial hypocholesterolemia individuals, it declined with their age. it actually declines. So people that have this genetic ability to make too much, an overabundance of cholesterol, their risk of cardiovascular disease actually declined as they aged. How is that possible, right? You would think it'd be the exact opposite, and that's not true. So their studies stopped a little too short, I think. The other thing, the elderly group of folks that were exposed to decades of high LDL-C demonstrate no increase of the cardiovascular disease mortality, as well as no increase in morbidity for strokes compared to the general population. So this undermines all that whole lipid hypothesis, right? That high LDL is inherently atherogenic and that it's going to cause plaque in the arteries. They also did a couple studies, and what they actually saw was it's the group that had hypercholesteremia. They were making an abundance of cholesterol and also had a gene that that made them susceptible to developing blood clots. So it was that coupled with this gene that made them more exposed to the chance of having cardiovascular disease. So it was the group that had this polymorphism for prothrombin, which is a coagulation factor. So that is what they saw. I see you on TikTok. I see us, we're going live, and I see a couple of people asking questions. Should I go on all protein, no carbs for a month? I'm not a doctor, so I can't recommend prescribe. But I think what I tell a lot of clients is, listen to this. Try something. Try it. Yeah, try it for a month. Try something. See what happens. Get some data back. Get some feedback. If you've been doing plant-based for this whole time, well, try something different. Maybe for your body, it's going to be better. Maybe it's going to work more. Try it and see what it works. Everyone says, oh, you can't do that. Why would you do that? Why not? Maybe for your body and your genetics and your environment, everything, it's going to be different. So I would say try it and see what works. I have my own. I don't think it's a bad thing. I'll tell you right now, I'm not dogmatic about anything. I think too many people are in this camp of keto, carnivore. It has to be this or it has to be nothing. And I'm all about more balance. I think there is a balance. I think all of these things are really great in the short run. But I think at the end of the day, you need to come back to balance, because when we see with all these diets, a lot of times people don't stick to them because they're just way too restrictive and too hard to do. So that's my advice to the world out there in TikTok. Here's the other big thing, increase. And I mentioned this earlier, but this study talks about it in this journal review. Second thing is this: when LDL goes up, they see it's a huge component to the immune system, a more robust immune system. Elevated levels of LDL helps the immune function. It protects against bacterial infection, which can promote the development of atherosclerosis. So here we are trying to lower LDL, but then that's an immune function. So now you're putting yourself more at risk for cardiovascular disease, more at risk for inflammation, because you're lowering those things, right? The third thing they found is this group, again, that has this ability to make an overabundance of cholesterol. They found that, guess what? Based on what they don't know, their genetics or their lifestyle choices, they had a low rate of type 2 diabetes, which we just mentioned earlier. And that had a significant risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So just those 3 observations that they made really prove that just because you have a high level of LDL doesn't mean anything when it comes to cardiovascular disease. So great study showing this. What they also saw is that it related to this was that when they treated people with statin patients that were associated with that CAC score, which is the cardiac score that they do when they do a huge that cardiac scan, what they saw is that it had nothing to do, LDL, these cardiac scores had nothing to do with high levels of LDL, had nothing to do with it, which I find to be fascinating. 1/3 of the individuals that had very high levels of LDL cholesterol, greater than 190, that was considered higher than high level, had a 0 CAC score, 0. So the 0 CAC score had a more predictive utility, they said. So if you want, it was more effective at predicting heart disease and cardiovascular diseases than LDL alone. That had nothing to do. By the way, you should check out, I did an old podcast I had with a heart disease expert who does these cardiac exams, Dr. Michael Timon. Check him out. I think he's in the Missouri. I should get him back on and we should talk about some of these things. But he does some amazing work. And if you go back to that podcast on the Hack Life podcast, you can see some of the things we talk about. Um, so again, this finding supports the view that individuals on a low carbohydrate diet with high levels of LDL and non-atherogenic issues, meaning they had no issues again with plaque buildup already, they wouldn't benefit from statin therapy. Other randomized control studies that they did, they did. There's a study called the Prosper study, and they had elderly men, aged 70 to 82, with pre-existing vascular diseases. They were all at risk for cardiovascular disease because they had hypertension, they had diabetes, they were maybe smokers. They were administered this statin. And then another group was administered the placebo. And then they were assessed for these fatal and non-fatal coronary events over a 3-year period. And what was noteworthy is the influence of HDL levels on their coronary events in the placebo and the statin related events, which I think you're going to find remarkable because I mentioned this again. In the apps without HDL, when HDL is high, it didn't matter what the total cholesterol was. That was basically, that's what this study also found. So subject on the placebo group, meaning they had low HDL, which was below 43. That's consistent with somebody with insulin resistance and an atherogenic lipid profile, okay? They developed a greater incidence of coronary events than the placebo subjects who had a high level of HDL, which is greater than 53, independent of their LDL. So this, again, the first observation demonstrates that high HDL-C levels is a superior indicator of cardiovascular disease risk than LDL just being untreated. So again, we have to look at everything. The second observation from the Prosper study is the benefits of statin treatment that occurred only for the subjects with low HDL. So independent of their LDL level. So what they found again is statin might have been beneficial if you had a low HDL and high triglycerides, but without that, statins really didn't do anything. It made no difference. So high LDL-C and a non-atherogenic lipid profile, meaning low triglycerides, high HDL, unlikely to benefit from any kind of statin therapy. Let me just repeat that again. This is the latest study that just came out a week ago. Again, we need to remember, and the last thing that the authors say is, therefore, a person on a low carbohydrate diet without any issues of plaque buildup in their body, meaning low triglycerides, high HDL, they're more likely to experience adverse effects from statins, meaning an increased risk of new onset type 2 diabetes and an increase in fasting blood glucose in patients without diabetes, mitochondrial dysfunction, tendinopathy, myopathy, acute kidney injury and renal failure, cognitive defects. Doesn't sound like it's very good, does it? So should you be on a statin? Well, again, I'm not a doctor. I can't recommend, but the latest studies would say for the majority of people, no. But we need to tie in. We need to get insulin resistance in check, and we need to get inflammation in check, and that's the key, guys. I hope this was helpful. I went long today. I went like almost 30 minutes. I try to make these bite-sized episodes, but because of this new study that just came out, it was really man, it was just, there was a lot to go over, and I wanted to give you some of that new information. If you have any more questions, I see some people are still reaching out online. Again, shoot me an email, info@joelevancoaching.com. I'm happy to reach out and connect with you guys there and assist you in any way. Or TikTok's not always the best place to go back and forth in chatting, but you can definitely get me on Instagram. That's usually a better platform for going back and forth. Happy to connect with you guys there. Have an amazing rest of your week. I can't wait to chat with you guys more about all these metabolic topics as they continue to change and we continue to evolve and learn more. It's amazing.